I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here with you all and for all of you for taking some time out of your day to talk with me about this very important topic. This is something I've been working on for 10 years. And so the fact that it's out in the world and that I can share it with you all means a whole lot to me. So, I promise not to be too in the weeds when it comes to numbers, but I wanted to start off by telling you all a bit about the context associated with what I like to call mass deportability. So we all talk about deportation, so the exclusion of non-citizens, people who lack US citizenship from the country. But I would argue, and as I do argue in my book, it's the possibility of deportation that characterizes most undocumented immigrants' lives in the country. And we can see this most clearly in this figure that I have here for you all, which charts the deportation rate per 100,000 undocumented immigrants in the US between 2010 and 2018. If we look just at the blue line, we'll observe that deportations overall are a persistent and prevalent phenomenon. But if we look at just the green line, which is the border deportation rate, deportations happening at the border, we observe that most deportations between 2010 and 2018 are concentrated at the US-Mexico border in particular. The remainder, given by that gray line, occurred from inside the United States in localities across the country. So this means that more than just deportation, it's deportation's possibility that weighs on the 10.5 million undocumented immigrants who are settled in the United States. And I call this possibility mass or massive because it weighs not just on undocumented immigrants, but also on their 9 million US citizen family members. And there's a disproportionate impact in particular on Mexicans and Central Americans, who constitute about 57% of the non-citizen population in this country, but 65% of all undocumented immigrants, and more than 90% of all deportations. Now, how did we get here? There are a lot of laws and regulations and policies that gave us this current era of mass deportability. And if there are some immigration lawyers in the room, you will all know far better the consequences of these laws and policies on people's everyday lives from your vantage point as helping folks navigate this system. But I want to give a broad strokes overview to those who may be less familiar with some of these consequential changes. The first big change happened starting in about 1996, but really blew up following the terrorist attacks of September 11th in 2001, which is federal local partnerships to police undocumented immigrants in their local communities nationwide. No longer is immigration enforcement a story of immigration officers at the Mexico-US border patrolling the ports of entry and the spaces in between these formal ports of entry. What is more commonplace, increasingly since 2015 in particular, is that local police officers who pull you over for a traffic ticket end up turning you over to immigration enforcement officers through something called a detainer request, which the Department of Homeland Security issues to any to local police departments to detain any non-citizen who they have in custody for an additional 48 hours beyond when they might ordinarily be released from custody for whatever small infraction they've been arrested for. And the second big change also happened around 1996, and it's the exclusion of undocumented immigrants from federally funded cash and food assistance and health insurance programs, with the exception of a limited form of emergency medical care through Medicaid in some states, and also given somewhat by the federal government. Although this really depends on the state you're in, with Texas being one extreme and California representing a completely different one that increasingly has become more open to providing undocumented immigrants with some public goods like health insurance and health care. Both of these big changes happened around 1996, which was the same time that there was a contemporaneous growth in mixed status families across this country in all 50 states, And by mixed status families, I just refer to families characterized by at least one parent who is undocumented and one child who is a US citizen. But there are various combinations that other researchers have considered, but that's the definition I'll go with for today. So because of the important changes that have happened since 1996 and the proliferation of undocumented and mixed status families in the United States since that time period, a growing body of scholarly work has investigated the consequences of these changes for undocumented immigrants, and in particular, what it means to be surveilled or watched by state authorities simply because you are undocumented. So, a lot of researchers have cataloged the consequences of this institutional surveillance, which sounds like a fancy term, but all it refers to is the consequences of policing in your everyday lives, as well as the vigilance that you experience by state authorities like teachers and doctors and social workers and people like that. So, on the one hand, one bucket of research shows that if you are undocumented, your legal status is a master status that dictates all of your opportunities and constraints, such that if you're undocumented, you're simply existing at the margins of society, never to interact with any institutional authority, and you're always on the run from law enforcement. But then there's this other body of research, primarily given by anthropologists who are working in this space, that says that undocumented immigrants not only engage with various societal institutions, but also keep records of that engagement with institutions with the express purpose of legalizing one day to show how valuable they are to society. And the key punchline of this research is that undocumented immigrants do this not because they want to or because they're good people, but because they have an instrumental purpose that, well, it's not enough to be here as an undocumented immigrant. I'm going to pretend to be as good as I am, even if I'm not so good as a person, because I think that's what people might expect of me. And, it's not, I think my argument in this book, and I try to be super cautious about overly criticizing any research, but I think the argument that I develop in this book is that it's somewhat disconnected from the everyday experiences of undocumented immigrants. So I zoom out and I ask three broad baseline questions about the experiences of undocumented immigrants as they manage different forms of surveillance in everyday life. First, I ask a very simple question of how do they even understand and experience institutional surveillance? I then ask how these understandings and experiences inform their engagement with institutional authorities like police officers, like doctors, like teachers, and so on and so forth. And then I take a long-term view and I ask to what extent does institutional surveillance matter for their opportunities to become green card holders and eventually US citizens? How does this surveillance end up mattering for their long-term societal membership? As you have no doubt been told now, I think about three times, the book is now out with Princeton University Press. It's available anywhere books are sold. And as Marcos mentioned at the start of this, I am very happy to autograph any copies for folks who are local or who order from the Stanford University bookstore. Just let me know, and I will pop into the bookstore to give my John Hancock. It would be my great honor. So I think about the answers to these various questions that I've posed in the book, Engage and Evade, which has been out for about 9 months now. It came out in June of last year. And it examines how undocumented immigrants with young children, all of whom are Latino, engage with the various institutions that surveil them as they enter and make a life in the United States. I pay particular attention to how undocumented immigrants make sense of the different forms of surveillance that they have to engage with or evade from before they enter the country to years after settling in it, and how their efforts to manage this surveillance are rooted in the overlapping legal, material, income and wealth, and social hardships as undocumented Latinos that characterize their daily lives in the United States while raising US citizen children. And I'm a sociologist, so I often use terms and phrases that are inspired by sociology, but I've tried writing the book in a way that is sort of unmoored from these concepts, or that where these concepts are informing the argument, but they're not totally dominating the argument with jargon and other buzzwords. And so let me walk you through what I mean by these theoretical frameworks. The key punchline is that my particular interest in the book is to examine interactions with authorities and surveilling institutions. Now, surveilling institutions are things that we all interact with on a daily basis, whether or not we're a US citizen or some other kind of legal status. And these institutions are simply those that monitor all people as a matter of law. So, for example, every time you go to school, for example, there's a record that you attended school. Every time you clock into work, there's a record that you've clocked into work. Every time you go to the doctor, there's a record that you visited the doctor. Now, we may not think of these as surveillance, but for undocumented immigrants who are often penalized for accessing many of these institutions, this surveillance feels especially fraught because many of them would like to stay off the government's radar. I make the argument that undocumented immigrants don't have that luxury of existing off the radar, that they instead can't be, that their lives cannot be solely dictated by their legal status. Rather, I draw on these theories of categorization and intersectionality, and in particular, what sociologists call symbolic interactionist theories, to make the very simple argument that they're multidimensional people who are more than their legal status, and that in fact, because they are also parents and family members and friends, they have to get out of the house, so to speak, more often than research that believes them to be simply dominated by their legal status would expect. So when they leave that house and they go to interact with surveilling institutions and authorities in them, they're dealing with what we call street level bureaucrats. So it's not some faceless person who exists to penalize and arrest and detain them, but rather it's somebody who they regularly interact with, whether it's that doctor or that teacher, and they're constantly evaluating one another in each interaction. And it's those mutual evaluations in those interactions that end up mattering for how people understand surveillance and the consequences of surveillance in their everyday lives. And I'll give you some flavor of what that means in just 1 second. But I want to tell you a little bit about how I studied this question. The book is primarily based on interviews and ethnographic observations that I collected in Dallas County, Texas, in the summer months of between June 2013 and August of 2018, alongside original analyses of national survey data that bolster some of the key findings from the interviews. Now, don't worry if you're not super mathematically inclined. The analyses of the survey data are buried in an appendix in the back of the book, and it's only the narrative that ends up mattering for the story that I tell. But for readers who want to, or for audience members who want to know more, I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A. So, like I mentioned, much of the book is anchored in these 89 interviews that I conducted over the years with 28 Latino immigrant families in Dallas, Texas, that make up 60 adults, 5 of whom are US born, and they have about 100 children, 97 of whom are US born. Among the immigrants I interviewed, most of them are undocumented, with a handful you might charitably call semi-legal, meaning that they have a precarious DACA or temporary protected status. And then we have 12 permanent residents who are also known as green card holders. And then finally, 4 naturalized citizens who were once undocumented, somehow became a permanent resident, and ultimately came on to naturalize and become US citizens. And the last source of data that I make use of in the book, and in particular chapter 4, is an ethnography of Dallas Immigration Court, where I observed immigration judges, immigration prosecutors, and immigration lawyers as they made very consequential decisions on cases for immigrants who resembled, in terms of their age profile and their family backgrounds, many of the families in my book. So I use these insights from Dallas Immigration Court to contextualize the experiences of many of the families I spoke with, some of whom never ended up in Dallas Immigration Court, and actually most of whom never ended up in Dallas Immigration Court, and most of whom never ended up legalizing by the end of the study. So I wanted to validate their perceptions of what immigration officials might do with records of their interactions with institutional authorities, with what actually happens when someone who resembles them ends up in immigration court and ends up either deported or legalizing. All right, so I want to give you one more simple take on the argument that I describe in the book, and it's that undocumented immigrants exhibit what I call a selective engagement with institutional surveillance. They sometimes interact with these authorities and the institutions, and sometimes they avoid them, depending on the type of surveillance they're dealing with and the social role and responsibility most salient in that encounter. So here's the idea. It's that people, including undocumented immigrants, have multiple responsibilities, and that people, including undocumented immigrants, have to align their institutional engagement with the perceived expectations of authorities who regularly monitor them. So, for example, if I'm undocumented and therefore ineligible for public assistance or food stamps or whatever it may be, I better not take advantage of those benefits, even especially because I'm not eligible. And regardless, I don't have access to them, but even if I could access them, I better not. It's safer that I don't. On the other hand, if I'm undocumented and my kid is going hungry and my kid is a US citizen, I might really seriously consider taking food stamps or food assistance on behalf of my US citizen kid to ensure that a teacher doesn't tell me that they're going to call CPS or the cops on my kid who's complaining of hunger every day at school. So as you make these decisions as to whether to engage with or evade these institutions that surveil you, undocumented immigrants have to engage in this short-term risk and reward calculation of what I call everyday forms of surveillance. What does it mean if I don't pay a speeding ticket, for example? And what does it mean if I don't take that teacher's advice and enroll my child in food assistance programs? Now, the added difficulty for undocumented immigrants is that they must weigh these risks against longer term risks about their societal membership as US citizens, perhaps down the road. If they avoid these interactions today, it may make them more vulnerable to policing in everyday life because a teacher might call the police on them or a doctor may report them for child neglect. But too much institutional engagement today may also render them ineligible for a future legalization opportunity. So the undocumented immigrants I've interviewed go on to negotiate and renegotiate these risks and rewards over time and ultimately find themselves in precarious situations about just how much access to US society they may have one day. And this especially comes up in the context of raising US citizen children. So we know that legal status excludes many undocumented immigrants from various forms of service institutions like healthcare institutions, like some higher education institutions, and certainly from public assistance institutions. But we also know that they must be involved in these very same institutions on behalf of their US citizen kids in many ways. So how then, I ask in chapter 3, and which I'll present a bit about today, do undocumented immigrants manage their involvement in service institutions? For the undocumented folks I interviewed, their legal status reflects a bundle of marginalized social positions. They are not only undocumented, but also poor and racialized ethnic minorities in the US. And they understand this viscerally, as Eduardo, Alejandra, and Samuel's quotations teach us. Eduardo tells us that they are not paid as much as their US-born counterparts, that they need to save money for those inevitable days when work would be scarce, as Alejandra tells us, and that it would be nice if they didn't have to live day by day, as Samuel tells us. But in the end, as Samuel says, quote, you have to be okay with what you have, but you do still dream of more, of not living day to day, you know? Now, one symptom of these correlated hardships that undocumented immigrants face is widespread reports of workplace discrimination among the people I studied. Most common was wage theft, which is when employers withhold wages earned for hard labor performed. Esmeralda described it as a form of humiliation that she has experienced. She says sometimes they take advantage of us being undocumented, having us work, but humiliating us by keeping our pay. Rafael, who works as a house painter, recounted an instance when a client refused to pay him $300 for his work. And he refused to leave the worksite without payment, so the client called the police on him. Rafael left immediately because he was worried about the danger associated with the police showing up in such a hot moment. And on his way home, he called his wife, Araceli, who I also interviewed as part of the study. And Araceli told me that all of a sudden, Rafael hung up on her when he told her the police were following her. And she didn't know what was happening. She said, "My nerves were killing me. Time went on, and he did not call me. What was happening? Maybe they had already detained him. I imagine the worst had happened." And later on, nothing bad had happened to Rafael. He ended up making it home that evening with a stern police warning. But Araceli reminded me later in the interview that it's possible, had things gone the opposite direction, that it's possible I would not have even been able to interview the family because they all would have fled to Mexico to be with Rafael. One additional symptom of these correlated adversities are few perceived opportunities for moving up at work and in life more broadly. Alma, who spent 10 years working at the same local fast food chain, was promoted to be a kitchen manager, but reminded me that a promotion didn't come with a raise. She said, "I like my job, but it would be nice if my efforts were reflected in what they paid me." And the evidence from Marina, who is very similar to Alma in terms of length of stay in the US, in terms of the kind of industry that she works in, and in terms of high school, her level of educational attainment. But the key difference between Alma and Marina is that Marina was able to benefit from DACA and gain work authorization, whereas Alma could not. So Marina ultimately was able to receive a raise immediately to minimum wage once she got DACA, and later began training to be an assistant manager at that same restaurant. So it was that work authorization provided by DACA that made all the difference for Marina's career advancement, and that continues to trap Alma into this cycle of low pay with a high amount of work. Now, despite all these adversities, the undocumented immigrants I interviewed tried their best to get by each day. They worked, they relied on family members and friends for support, and when things got desperate, they often sought assistance from church or food pantries. But things became more complicated over their years in the country when they started having children of their own. Indeed, for everyone I talked to, parenthood to a US born child was their gateway to engagement with these service institutions. Norma, for example, who spent 18 years in the US avoiding many institutions to start with, took her sister's advice and went to the doctor once she discovered she was pregnant, and explained how a social worker visited her and her husband, Pablo. She said that they told me that they would help the kids because they are children who were born here, but not me and Pablo because we do not qualify for that. Her children went on to receive public health insurance, WIC, which provides supplemental assistance to women and infant children of a certain income status, and also food assistance. Natalia, who had spent a similar amount of time in the US, also described pregnancy as her gateway into the public health insurance realm, as well as into the receipt of WIC for her children. Now, this engagement with service institutions goes beyond public health insurance, and it goes way beyond a child's birth. Parenthood regularly exposes people facing multiple hardships to authorities and service institutions. And from these parents' perspectives, their interactions with institutional authorities can reproduce those very same hardships that they are intended to counteract. So Adriana, who has spent 21 years in the US, receives a yearly income of about $12,000 from the father of her children. And she stretches this limited income through several forms of public assistance, including public health insurance for her kids, WIC, and food assistance. And she says that she understands that the scope of her engagement with these service institutions creates a unique tension for her as an undocumented parent. She says many people say you shouldn't ask for help, but if the children were born here, they have a right to health insurance. And thank God they get it. I even signed up for food assistance because I'm not rich. The children need health insurance. Imagine what would happen if they got sick or didn't have enough to eat. How would I pay for their medical expenses? How would I pay for their doctor's visits when I take them for their checkups? And how am I supposed to pay for their food? These questions that Adriana poses, how to cover her children's basic expenses with limited income and without public assistance, underscore her desire to be a good parent to her 3 children. And Adriana emphasized that she'll maintain this engagement even if it may cost her an opportunity to legalize one day. She said, I hear people say it will affect me if the government lets us fix our documents one day. I don't know if they want to scare us or are trying to warn people, if it's true or a lie, but there's no time to stop and worry. The children were born here, and it's my job to take care of them however I can. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead and I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to give you all a brief glimpse into some of the reading, some of the actual work. I'm going to do a slight reading because at the end of the day, the undocumented immigrants I interviewed made a bet that this short-term engagement with these authorities every day may help them one day to legalize, not because, of some instrumental reason, but simply because this is the kind of immigrant that the federal government wants to be in the country. They want good parents, they want hard workers, they want people who are willing to sacrifice themselves to promote their kids' well-being without taking too many benefits on their own behalf. So I want to read from one part of the book and tell you all about Monica. And I'll be somewhat quick on this just so that we can spend some time on the Q&A. Monica, who had been living without authorization in the United States since she entered in 2001, called to ask for a ride a few weeks after our interview in 2015. Almost 40 years old, she had spent nearly half her adult life as an undocumented immigrant. But all my interview questions about her daily life as an undocumented immigrant had recently prompted her, albeit unintentionally, to search online for a nonprofit organization that might facilitate her legalization. Her US-born husband, Ignacio, helped her pick an organization and schedule a consultation, but couldn't drive her there. He had to work during the day. As I drove her to the nonprofit for her appointment, Monica recounted. Ignacio told me that it took someone from Kentucky to come to Dallas to push you to legalize. I chuckled, reminding Monica that I was not from Kentucky, but from Wisconsin. The point remains, she emphasized, as we pulled up to an unremarkable office building, concrete except for 4 glossy rows of windows. We found the nonprofit's office tucked in a small corner suite on the 2nd floor. A sign hung from the door. Obtén la ciudadanía. La ciudadanía cambia tu vida. Get citizenship. Citizenship changes your life. Monica led us inside. A young woman who appeared to be Latina and identified herself as the secretary greeted us. She offered us an intake form, and the form asked for all the information required for a legalization application, including biographical details about the sponsor, the beneficiary, and their shared life. Monica had come prepared. She rifled through a red folder overstuffed with records, birth certificates for herself, her husband, and her 3 children, her marriage license, several years' worth of tax returns, her children's social security cards, and several copies of each of these documents that Monica had brought just in case. She filled out the form and breezed through most questions, but paused on the last. Have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime in the United States? We exchanged knowing glances, and Monica marked a deflating yes in the form. Moments later, the secretary escorted us into the office of the nonprofit's staff immigration attorney. The attorney, who also appeared to be Latina, leafed through the completed intake form and homed in on the question about Monica's criminal record. Monica looked glum as she explained that she had been arrested in Paris, Texas, for stealing baby formula. She hadn't done so by choice. She had unwittingly joined an exploitative theft ring when a new employer in her rural hometown in the Mexican state of Guanajuato offered to smuggle her into the US. The attorney seemed less concerned with the extenuating circumstances than with what records Monica might have accrued in the process. Did you see a criminal or immigration judge? Were your fingerprints taken? Were you convicted? Monica remembered it was a criminal judge, but she could not recall whether she had been fingerprinted or convicted. The attorney explained how important the details were. We can't take your case if you have a criminal record that might derail your application. We just don't have the capacity to handle complicated petitions. But if your record is clean, we would be able to move forward. Now, Monica didn't end up moving forward with this place or this nonprofit simply because I was leaving town the next day and wouldn't be able to drive her to Paris, Texas to see the police department about Monica's criminal record. She didn't end up needing to make it to Paris because she was able to find another attorney who her sister used for a DACA application. And that attorney was able to do everything remotely through detailed background checks through FBI and other criminal databases to ensure that Monica would not end up in a situation where she submitted a legalization application and ultimately got deported. To fast forward to the end of the story, Monica ends up becoming a legal permanent resident. So when I re-interviewed her in 2018, she told me that she feels blessed to now have a green card and to live as a permanent resident. She said this whole thing turned out to be a blessing. I never thought they would give me papers. When you still live here illegally for so many years, you worry that they won't want to. Still, no stranger to life as an undocumented immigrant, Monica noted that her green card doesn't eliminate that old feeling of uncertainty. Just because you have papers doesn't mean they won't kick you out of the country. Even with papers, you are not safe. One mistake and you must leave the country. You have to make sure your record stays clean and that you are a good person. So I think Monica's story tells us a couple of key points that help to recap some of the core arguments of the book. That much of the engagement that she and others in the study have with institutions that surveil them emerges in part from the overlapping hardships that they face. That these hardships raise the stakes of interacting with teachers and doctors and police officers and so on and so forth, especially when children's well-being comes into play. And it also teaches us that people worried about punishment may align their institutional engagement with the perceived expectations of the authorities who surveil them. So in the book, I use all of this in an appendix to create a testable implication that I test outside of the context of Dallas, Texas, and using national survey data, which is to show that undocumented parents may have lower rates of involvement in these institutions when it comes to their own selves. But once you consider how much they're interacting with these institutions on behalf of their kids, you find that they have similar rates of interaction with these institutions that surveil them once you account for their interactions with their children. And that's detailed more fully in the book. So to close, I make a couple of big arguments in the book, which is that we shouldn't be thinking about surveillance as exclusionary, as inherently exclusionary, or simply just inclusionary, but rather it really depends on the form of surveillance that you're encountering in a particular kind of institution, and whether you're interacting with that institution about yourself or on your own behalf or on behalf of your US citizen kid. And then the other point that I make is that simply being involved in institutions, which we as sociologists tend to think of as a good thing, right? People are going to school, people are going to work, can itself reflect inequality because just because you have a job doesn't mean your job is well paid. Just because you have a job doesn't mean you're not being exploited at work. And just because your kids are enrolled at school doesn't mean that they're constantly being shuffled. Not that it doesn't mean that they're not being constantly shuffled between schools uh, in light of deportations happening in one's local community. And more broadly, I make the argument that the kinds of interactions that we see are coming out of a coercive rather than a sort of voluntary process where I have to be a really good parent. So I have to be extra careful about how involved I am in these different institutions. I'm running low on time and I don't want to be cut off by any of the Stanford Alumni Association staff. And so I will just tell you that in the conclusion, I make a couple of arguments about how much of the discourse politically about immigration enforcement is exactly around this question, which is how can we go from having 10.5 million undocumented immigrants to zero? And I talk all about a lot of potential solutions, but the long and short of it is that I think that that's the wrong question, because I think the right question is that we'll always have undocumented immigrants in the US. It's sort of a feature and not a bug of our immigration system. So I ask instead how we can limit the inequalities that we impose upon the undocumented population. And here I offer many more suggestions. And one of them is inspired by California, which recently expanded the right to public health insurance for indigent undocumented immigrants. And I also call for the decriminalization of undocumented immigration, as well as the restoration of a Social Security number for undocumented immigrants in the country. My very last slide before turning it back over uh, will be how can you help? And I think there are three things I'd like you all to take away from this today. Depending on your capacity and interest, I have the most involved, the least involved you can be here. So one suggestion I like to give if you have a lot of time for involvement is to train with VISTA, which is the Villanova Interdisciplinary Immigration Studies Training Program for Advocates. Uh, Graduates of this program can help to serve immigrants and refugees in partnership with community-based organizations, filling out DACA applications that an attorney will go on to check for you. And even if you do the right training, to help represent immigrants in immigration court where they are not guaranteed a right to an attorney. The second thing that you can do is to volunteer. And if you do volunteer, I'd encourage you to volunteer regularly with a community-based organization near you, drive people around, distribute food to people in need, and so on and so forth. I always think it's good to offer any kind of help, but especially if you can maintain like a 3 to 6 month commitment. That's that sweet spot, I think, that these organizations really could use your work. And lastly, I always say if you can't give time, you should give money. You can donate to bond funds, and I recommend one in your local community. So I've offered Freedom for Immigrants or the Bay Area Immigration Bond Fund as examples. And the reason to give to bond funds is because there are folks who are languishing in immigration detention who have been approved for bond by an immigration judge, but who simply can't afford it. And so by collecting money and giving to your local communities, bond funds, you'll be able to reunite families who've been separated by immigration detention, at least temporarily. So with that, I want to thank you all for letting me go about 2.5 minutes over. I'd like to welcome Marcos back to the stage for the Q&A, and I look forward to the conversation.
Professor Asad, we're giving you a round of applause, even though you can only hear me. Just imagine it's a room full of people clapping, and we
I
have
appreciate it.
questions already in the Q&A boxes as we're getting those together. Professor, if you don't mind me turning it personal for a moment, I was really moved by the story that you wrote right at the beginning of your book, and so I'm going to start with the question, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Why did your Baba carry around his naturalization card in his wallet?
So Marcos is a detailed and astute reader of my book. As it turns out, I'm the son of Palestinian immigrants, and my parents never, we can set aside other things that we might talk about at the moment, but my parents came to the U.S. more or less voluntarily as economic migrants. My dad is on a student visa, my mom on a green card. One day I was rifling through my dad's wallet, as I often did when I was home from graduate school for Thanksgiving. And I had found this old naturalization card in his wallet. And my dad has been a US citizen for, I don't know, 30, 40 years at this point. And as it turned out, when I asked him why he did that, even though he had no reason to as a US citizen at this point, he told me he felt safer with it on him simply because he had almost lost his student visa one day when he was not a naturalized citizen, when he was still a new immigrant to the country. And I think what he realized is that that card made him feel safer. Now, my mom, who's a naturalized citizen and who came on a green card, has no idea where her card is. And that's simply because she was never in danger of losing her formal societal membership. So for her, the threat of being kicked out of the country never appeared. And so it doesn't linger with her as a naturalized citizen who hasn't had the same kind of experience of having almost lost her legal status one day.
Well, so even 30 years later for your dad, that mental stress of what might happen was hanging over him.
Yes, absolutely. And it's something that sticks with all of us, right? The possibility of the worst thing that could ever happen to you. You kind of it doesn't go away.
Which brings us to our first question from Pilar Johnson, Professor Asad in the chat box. Pilar asks if you wouldn't mind discussing those health and mental health effects the people you talk to experience as a result of those chronic stressors you describe, not only from your research, but from your own father.
Yeah. So I'll start with my own research and then sort of zoom into my own family story. I've published a couple of articles thinking about this idea, which is, and we've got one coming out in 3 weeks. Stay tuned for a feature in the Stanford report about it. But the basic premise is that the threat of deportation is something that manifests across, especially among Latinos in the United States. It affects not just undocumented immigrants and not just green card holders, but also naturalized citizens and US born citizens. So, what I found in an article I published in 2020 is that about 33% of Latino US born citizens, US born citizens who are Latino, worry about deportation. Of course, they can't be deported because they are US citizens by birth, but they fear deportation either because they might be misrecognized as undocumented, given the sort of strong overlap between race and legal status in the imagination of immigration authorities. But they also worry about family members who they might know who might be worried about deportation. And so for US born citizens, many of the same mental health consequences that we observe among undocumented immigrants and permanent residents manifest for them. In this latest article we have coming out, our punchline is that whereas, if you try to predict mental health distress among US born citizens using actual deportations, you'll do a bad job of predicting that mental health distress because, of course, US born citizens are not really eligible or vulnerable to deportation. But if instead you use a measure of how salient or how much the national conversation around immigration enforcement, so this is very easy. If you go to google.com/trends and you search for Taylor Swift, like you can see what the long-term trend conversation with Taylor Swift has been between 2011 to present day. You can do the same thing with immigration enforcement. So you can look to see how that conversation has waxed and waned over time. And you can then run a statistical model that uses that national conversation to predict psychological distress among Latino US born citizens, naturalized citizens, and non citizens. And as it turns out, that national conversation certainly predicts negative psychological distress among the US born citizens, whereas actual enforcement behaviors predict worse psychological distress among the naturalized citizens and the non-citizens. So zooming in on my dad, I think at this point it's more of a chronic stress type thing. He's kind of assimilated that sort of worry in his everyday life, but it sort of reactivates as it might for a lot of us whenever he leaves and re-enters the country. It's sort of that moment of will I be allowed back in or will I not? And I think that's the most he really thinks about it beyond in the back of his mind, really, rather than sort of a front of mind uh, concern.
I remember my grandmother, we're from Arizona, becoming a citizen much later in life because of all the news that she would watch about SB 1070 in Phoenix. And it just, that stress on her would just completely scare her. I didn't see the Swifty connection coming, so you're sort of moved there. Um,
She's
Griffin,
relevant everywhere.
absolutely, eras. One of the other questions coming out is, can you talk a little bit about the statistics that you found, and was there one that was particularly shocking to you as you did the research for your book?
Yeah, I think, statistics are everywhere, right? And I think they're a very powerful political tool. And so one sort of criticism often lobbied at undocumented immigrants is that they don't pay their fair share of taxes. So let's not even worry about how much undocumented immigrants pay into the tax base because it's quite a lot in the billions of dollars a year. But I think the most shocking statistic that I learned is that Social Security that sort of allows elderly adults who've retired to sort of continue to live with some kind of meaningful income would not be solvent were it not for the contributions of undocumented immigrants who will not benefit from those same contributions. So they're paying into the Social Security system, keeping it afloat, but they will never have access to their own retirement contributions down the road because they're not eligible for Social Security benefits. And so I think that to me was probably one of the most shocking things that I discovered. But I think the other thing that I'll keep in mind is that about 20 to 25% of all deportations that have happened since 2007 have involved the parent of at least one US born child, such that now there are about 500,000 US born children living in Mexico. And there are researchers who conclude that much of the reason why these 500,000 US born children are living in Mexico is because they're the children of a parent who has either, voluntarily returned to Mexico because they feared deportation or because the whole family has been uprooted because of one or more parents' deportation from the United States. So I think those two stand out to me.
And you started talking about this earlier, but one of the things that I found really interesting in the book is you mentioned maybe us reframing the conversation a little bit, not thinking only about numbers of deportation, but that we're in a state of deportability. Do I have that right? Can you say a
That's
little
right.
bit?
Yeah, simply that, if we focus on the people who are actually kicked out of the country, and certainly their experiences and their stories matter and they're relevant. And I think deportation is probably a policy we need to revisit and think about who's deported and under what conditions and whether we should even have deportation to begin with. But beyond that, we simply don't have the capacity or resources as a country to kick everyone who's undocumented out of the country. And even George W. Bush, when he was president, said it's neither wise nor realistic to kick out the 10 million undocumented immigrants who are living in the United States. And so what the US has done instead is shift toward this motto where they kick out enough people to show that deportations can happen, but not so many people such that they're interrupting the labor base or completely disrupting family life in the United States. And so they use this possibility of deportation as a threat that coerces or compels good behavior, superlative behavior among undocumented immigrants who are not superlative or well behaved because they're just worried about deportation, but simply because most people are just good, average, decent people, including in Mexico, including in Central America. And so when they come here, if it feels onerous what we're doing to these people, and it really is, when the psychic toll of all of this is very onerous. But for a lot of people I interviewed, they also said, well, it's not too hard because I know that I'm not gonna, if I come to your house, why would I jump onto your bed? In the same way that if you come to my house, why would you jump on my bed? And so like these taken for granted assumptions of yes, we are coercing people to be good moral citizens to keep them in this country so that they can avoid deportation. But at the same time, for a lot of the people I talked to, it's not that they accepted this coercion, but it's that they thought of it as somewhat normal or manageable because they didn't think of it as completely different from what they might otherwise be doing anyway.
So not an easy answer, but here comes the big crystal ball question then in that spirit from Marcus in the chat. What is the best way to handle this, dude? What's your take?
Wow. So I wish I had a magic wand. One thing I've been doing over the last year has been interviewing immigration advocates, lawyers, social workers, and so on and so forth from across the country on Zoom. And the very last question I asked them in my interviews are similar to this one, which is if you had a magic wand and infinite power to do everything imaginable uh, to improve the immigration system, what is the one change you would make? And there was no agreement there. Some people said legalize undocumented immigrants. Some people said, you know, decriminalize undocumented immigration. And I think my answer to this question is twofold. Number one is I think for the undocumented immigrants that we have who are settled here, who have families here, and even if they do not have children, I would just like to snap my fingers and make them all green card holders tomorrow with a shortened pathway to citizenship. Usually, once you become a green card holder, you have to spend 3 to 5 years as a permanent resident before you're allowed to naturalize. I think people have been in this country for 15 or 20 years already. I want to get rid of that 3 to 5 year pathway and just let people become citizens within a year or two, if not even faster than that. And then the other thing I would do would be to, and this is a very sort of assuming that I don't have a transformative potential here to do all the things I would like to do. I think the other thing I would like to do is to simply make life easier for people by giving them a social security number, work authorization, and a driver's license. If you do those three things, which is, undocumented people used to have access to a social security number in 1972. It's just that we as the federal government decided that was no longer acceptable. But if you restore all of those rights, suddenly all of the things that criminalize people in everyday life, workplace, working legally versus illegally, driving with a license versus without a license, getting worried about being pulled over, workplace raids, all of those disappear. So I think those are my two answers if I had to give an on-the-spot answer. But as my 20-page conclusion shows, Marcos, like there's a lot that we can do. And I hope that we will be in a position. But I'll just say the one thing I don't think we should do is more criminalization, more border security, all of that sort of stuff. I think we've tried it and it's very clear it's not working. It's disconnected from the reasons why people migrate. So instead, we should be thinking about interventions that help us to make people's lives easier at the point of migration, as well as at the point of settlement in the United States.
You also mentioned, and our time is running short, unfortunately, but you also do mention in the book that one kind of uh, obvious thing that people can do is go talk to an attorney. What is the barrier for people, would you say, given the conversations you had, for people just simply going to talking to an attorney? Obviously, access, money. Just say a little something
Yeah.
about that. Stuff.
Access money, of course, are super relevant, but it's also the case that people don't know what talking to an attorney will do, right? Most people who talk to an attorney only talk to an attorney once they've been caught up in immigration proceedings. And at that point, it's somewhat too late because 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to end up deported. But there may be people who are eligible to legalize now, maybe because their oldest kid is 21 years old, maybe because of some other kind of legal eligibility that they're not aware of. And talking to an attorney would help them to sort of get that process going, but they're just kind of scared of coming out as undocumented to a system that feels very threatening to them. And so I think in addition to the financial barriers and there's this kind of fear of coming out as undocumented, because you've managed to live in the US for 15 or 20 years undetected. So why rock the boat? And so people feel more comfortable with the stability rather than the uncertainty of what might happen were they to go talk to an attorney who they can't even afford anyway.
Well, I feel like we've really just started the conversation, and here we are at almost the end of our time. Professor Asad, we want to give you the final word here, if you can share with us some closing remarks, but we also want to thank you for your time.
Yeah. First of all, Marcos, I really appreciated this conversation with you and to the rest of you for being here today. I think the last thing I'll say is just remembering that regardless of our own racial or ethnic background or citizenship status, that we are all part of a global interconnected struggle for justice. And I think we need to remember that what's happening at the Mexico-US border, we're not absolved of that. What's happening in the Middle East, we're not absolved of that. I think we need to be thinking of ways that we can help people lead lives, healthy, productive lives, independent of political forces that may be willing to divide us. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Professor Assad's new book, Engage and Evade, is available at the Stanford bookstore. He will come and sign it. Perhaps Taylor Swift will come and sign it as well.
One can dream.
Professor Assad, a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, all of you who are coming to a SLAA event for the first time, or you're an old friend. We hope to see you again.
Thank you, Marcos.